Menorca is one of the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean Sea. Well known for a huge collection of megaliths, Menorca has seen human activity since the prehistoric era. This period was the Talayotic period, which lasted until 123 BCE. The island fell under Roman occupation, Vandal conquest, the Byzantine Empire, and centuries later, British occupation. It is now part of Spain, and its official languages are Catalan and Spanish. But an island that has seen so much human activity for so long is bound to have a legend or two. Menorca's tales involve religious icons, enchanted cities, giants, and even the Cyclops. Let's explore them further in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. It does feel like I'm quite well named, considering the fact that we've just suddenly gone into a cold snap as I'm recording this, and it also seems quite timely that I'm looking at Menorca and a rather lovely, warm, sun-drenched island, again, while we're in the middle of November, in the middle of a cold snap. Now, we are doing Menorca because it was a request, like the other islands that I've been focusing on this month, and I thought it made a nice contrast with Ynys Môn last week, which obviously is off northwest Wales. But anyway, let's crack on with some legends from Menorca, and we're going to start off with the Bull of Menorca, because archaeologists found a bronze bull at the Toralbaden Solort village. One theory suggests that the original inhabitants of the island came from Crete, so the bull would link to tales of the Minotaur from the Minoan civilization. And this evidence of a bull god makes more sense when we consider one of Menorca's legends. So the highest point in the island is Monte Toro at 358 metres above sea level, and people originally believed that a bull lived at the summit. A group of monks of the Order of Santa Maria della Merced couldn't quite buy into the idea that a bull wouldn't let people reach the top of the mountain, and even more unusual, they saw lights at the top of the hill that they couldn't explain. So there was only one thing for it: they decided to climb the mountain, and they were shocked to discover, yes, a bull did live at the summit. He wasn't particularly pleased to see them, yet he calmed down when they showed him their crucifixes. The bull actually helped them up the last part of the path, even moving boulders for them, and he led them to a cave where they found an image of the Virgin of El Toro, the island's patron saint. The monks built a chapel on the site to mark the location, and there is a sanctuary to the Virgin on the mountain with a Black Madonna as its centrepiece. Local farmers actually hid the statue during the Spanish Civil War to keep her safe. I thought that was quite an interesting story. Obviously, we don't know if they actually did follow a bull, but I just thought it was quite interesting that the stories claim that the bull actually helped them to find the cave. But I think, strangely, the island is also associated with Greek mythology in a different direction from the Minotaur, because historian Mauricio Obregon believed the ancient island of Cyclops might actually lie among the Balearic Islands, and Menorca was a good candidate. So basically, let's have a look at who the Cyclops was for this to make sense. So according to Homer's Odyssey, Poseidon seduces a sea nymph, and their child Polyphemus grows up to become a giant, and he embarks on life as a shepherd. One day, Odysseus and his crew turn up seeking the Cyclops. They await Polyphemus' return in his cave and demand a gift once he appears. Polyphemus decides he's not going to do this, refuses, and traps the intruders in his cave, even eating 2 of the crew. The next day, he eats 2 more and heads off to work looking after his flock with the rest of the crew trapped in the cave. When he returns, he eats another 2 men. So at this point, Odysseus has lost half of his crew and needs to do something. So he gets Polyphemus drunk on undiluted wine and blinds him with a stick. Obviously, remember, the Cyclops only has 1 eye. Odysseus and the remaining men sneak out of the cave tied to the bellies of the sheep, as Polyphemus has let the sheep out to graze. Of course, getting what's left of his crew back on board ship isn't really enough for Odysseus, so he taunts the blinded Polyphemus from his ship. Polyphemus does try throwing rocks at the ship, but misses because obviously he can't see, so he asks his father for help in getting his revenge, so Poseidon calls up a fearsome storm. Now, there is some debate about who's actually at fault here, because Polyphemus doesn't respect the rules of hospitality to care for his guests, though I would argue they're not really guests if they've turned up in his cave while he's out and then demand stuff. So it is a little bit of a tricky one. But why does anyone think that the Cyclops lived on Menorca? Well, it seems that the huge T-shaped rock structures among the prehistoric sites like Torre den Galmes are one factor. These structures are just so big that people think that only giants could have built them. Though it's not the only theory, and some people also think that Polyphemus lived on Sicily, and his hurling rocks at Odysseus' ship is believed to explain the Cyclops rocks at Architrezza off Sicily. The Cyclops myth itself is believed to come from the discovery of mammal skulls such as the elephant, due to the large nasal opening that looks like a single eye socket. But I thought that was quite interesting that people had actually tried to figure out where this particular island of Polyphemus might be, and that Menorca might be one of them. Now obviously I've mentioned these giant T-shaped structures, and they're called taules or tables in Catalan, and the structures were originally buried so that only the tabletop was visible above ground, and these taules all sit inside a horseshoe-shaped wall of stones with the entrance directly opposite the front of the monument, and they mostly face south with a good view of the horizon. I think there's only one of them that doesn't, and that's because it was moved. Now no one actually knows what these monuments represented, or if the Talayots even had a god to represent in stone. That said, Spanish archaeologist J. Mascaro Pasarius suggested that the taula is actually a simplified representation of a bull's head. So if you look at the downward point of the T, that would be like the bull's face, and the horizontal part of the T would then be the horns at the top. That doesn't explain why the taulas were buried, or indeed why the enclosures took the shape that they did. Other theories suggest that the taulas were oriented according to the Centaurus constellation, which would have been visible from Menorca 3,000 years ago. Once precession made the constellation hard to see because it's largely only really visible now in the southern hemisphere, the Talayots may have abandoned the taulas. Now, a better theory is that the taulas actually acted as a calendar to track the movement of the moon. So Valdemar Fenn proposed the idea in 1930, and while it is quite difficult to definitively prove, it does suggest a prehistoric interest in astronomy. And this is basically because when you're looking at the monument's face on, the moon, when it appears sort of to the top left of the monument, you can then track the moon, because I think it's like every year when you look at the monument, it's then moved another 1.5 degrees, so it ends up after 9 years directly across the top right corner of the top part of the taula, and then it reverses that and goes back. So you can basically track the moon's cycle and things like that. And it's also because of the number of columns and so on that are in each of these enclosures, it was also believed to be able to predict things like lunar eclipses and what have you as well. And I quite like the idea when people start coming up with monuments to actually track the moon rather than the sun, because obviously there's some cracking monuments aligned to the summer solstice or the winter solstice and so on. But I think the idea of tracking the moon, because it's the shorter cycle, in some ways almost makes more sense. But Menorca's high concentration of prehistoric sites has also prompted stories of giants living in the island. So in that context, Polyphemus makes a natural contender to be one of those giants. And the fact that the taulas actually appear nowhere else supports that theory, so they are completely unique to Menorca. But in terms of other giants, though, there is a folktale surrounding the rock named Esfustesa Giganta, or the giantess's spindle, of the Torralba den Salot settlement. So according to the legend, the giantess from a nearby well carried a trough of water at midnight on her head for a sacrifice at the taula, and she returned to the well following the sacrifice. And in the folklore, the giantess guards the monuments and makes rope with her spindle after the sacrifice. So I quite like the idea of it not being necessarily the stone itself that moves, which is something that you see in British standing stone folklore, but it's actually a giantess carrying water between monuments at midnight, which seemed like an interesting approach to the story. But of course, giants appear in another legend on the island, and according to this particular tale, 2 giants who were brothers loved the same girl. Rather than letting her choose her bow for herself, they decided to each complete a difficult challenge, and whoever finished first won the girl. So one of them dug a well using his bare hands, and he obviously needed to reach water in order to win that particular challenge. And the other one built a navetta using massive stones. So a navetta is a megalithic chamber tomb found only on Menorca. They don't use cement, and the stones are held together by gravity, and they're very carefully arranged to make sure that they stay standing. And most of them date to around 1200 BCE. As the contest progressed, the building giant carried his final stone past his brother, just as his brother struck water at the bottom of the well. The digging giant yelled in triumph that he'd won, and his brother hurled the stone into the well in fury. The scream that came from the well turned the giant's blood to ice, because he realised he had just killed his brother at the bottom of the well. And according to most versions of the story, that explains why the Naveta des Turons is missing a stone at the very top. Now, incidentally, according to L.V. Grinsell, this explanation could be an early example of fake lore for the tourist trade, because there's not really enough to justify why a slab of stone is missing from the top, because it could also be that there's only one slab remaining, so it's difficult to know which way round to actually look at the stone that's left on the top. Now, the building giant apparently, as the story tells us, took his own life after realising he'd killed his brother, and the girl later died of sorrow after the whole sorry tale concluded. Incidentally, the Naveta des Turons, or the Vessel of Wood Pigeons, may be the oldest building in Europe, and it was restored in 2018 after vandalism damaged 81 stones, but the interior is currently closed to the public. So I thought that was quite an interesting story, because obviously we have done things like burial mounds and chamber tombs and so on in the British context. So it was really interesting to see one associated with Menorca as well. And yes, all of the research for this episode has made me really want to go to Menorca, so there is that. But we have got one final story, and this one is probably my favourite if you're allowed to have favourites. And this is the enchanted city of Parella. So according to one legend, the enchanted city of Parella only appears on the night of San Juan, or the 23rd of June, obviously that being St. John. So you might recognise the 23rd of June as St. John's Eve or Midsummer's Eve. And there is actually a festival for St. John held on Menorca every year. Now, the city of Parella appears west of the coast of Ciutadella, floating above the sea for a few seconds. That's if it appears, because certain conditions have to be met first. 7 men called Juan and 7 women called Juana need to meet by the sea to prompt Parella's appearance. And it only works if the people are complete strangers to each other and they sort of meet by chance, which seems like a bit of a coincidence to be able to wangle that one. Some versions of the legend say that you can hear its bells tolling when Parella does appear, and it's quite interesting because other sunken cities in folklore end up beneath the waves if the inhabitants are punished for sin, for example, or sometimes they're swept away during a giant storm and what have you. And in this particular instance, it seems that another city ended up jealous of Parella's beauty and actually cursed it to sink to the sea floor, which is a very different way of it happening. But one popular tale about the city sees a man order his servant boy to sharpen the ploughshare. Now the boy took it, went off to take it to get sharpened, but accidentally wandered into Parella after taking a wrong turn. He found himself in a beautiful city among gorgeous houses and stunning churches. He saw wealth literally everywhere he looked, and he brought back pieces for the plough made of pure silver. His rather somewhat surprised master gave him the same task the following day, because the ploughshare obviously still needed to be sharpened, and again the boy returned with silver pieces. On the 3rd day, the master issued the same task, but this time he followed the boy because he wanted to know where this silver was coming from. So he follows him at a distance, and they pass along the road to Ciutadella until the boy suddenly changed direction and headed to the coast. As he neared the shore, he stopped. Parella had gone. The master realised the problem. His naive and innocent servant could visit Parella thanks to his pure heart, but the curiosity and greed of adults made Parella vanish. Only a pure person visiting the city 3 times in a row could disenchant Parella. The master intervened too early, and now Parella was lost forever. I did really like that story because I've covered sunken cities before, but again in a British context, and they've usually been the kind of things where you can hear the bells tolling but underwater, whereas the idea that Parella appears above the sea is almost kind of a bit of a mirage. And obviously there is a name for that phenomenon that currently escapes me, but where you do see the reflections of things on the horizon that aren't actually there and it's all an optical illusion, does make me wonder if Parella possibly came from one of those. But I also quite like the idea that for this one you could actually disenchant it rather than it being lost beneath the waves forever. Hopefully this particular episode has whetted your appetite for Menorcan folklore. As I say, it was really, really interesting looking at these legends, and if you like megaliths, Menorca is absolutely the place to go, and it's really fascinating because of the fact that a lot of these types of monument or types of structure literally only occur on Menorca, which makes them absolutely unique. You can reach Menorca by air or by ferry from Barcelona. It is quieter than its Balearic siblings of Mallorca and Ibiza, and it obviously offers megaliths, as I've said, but also coastal walks and 18th century architecture as well, which, true, is a throwback to British occupation, but the cities do look really, really pretty. Its ancient links with Crete add an extra layer of mystery and myth, along with its various tales of giants and lost cities as well. So if you do go, do let me know. If you have been, do let me know. Have you seen any of these? Have you been around any of these megaliths or whatever? That would be really interesting to know what you think. And so please do feel free to let me know by posting a comment wherever you find this podcast episode, if of course there is a comment option available. If not, you can always just grab me on social media somewhere at Icy Sedgwick and let me know what you think. So that is the end of our Menorca episode. As I say, I really enjoyed doing that. Next week, we're going to have a look at New York's islands. And I want to have a look at Ellis Island, but I'm not necessarily sure there's enough for a whole episode. So we may do some of the other ones as well. But we'll see. But that seems to be the direction that I'm going in, because I did find a really interesting myth about Ellis Island, which would be quite cool to have a look at. So we'll be having a look at something American next week, which again was a request. Somebody did ask if I would do a little bit more North American folklore. And I thought, ooh, actually that fits really well with islands. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you enjoy next week as well. And as ever, I will see you soon. There are obviously tons of bonus episodes on Patreon if somehow you've caught up and you've run out of content to listen to. I can't remember how many bonus episodes there are now, but there's a lot. And if you do become a patron and you sign up, you do then get access to literally all of them in one go. There are obviously other bonuses as well. There's exclusive articles on there. There's the storytelling snippets and so on as well, depending on what level you choose to support at. And obviously any support helps go towards the various costs of running a podcast, which is all really rather boring, but unfortunately quite necessary. So we're talking hosting fees, website related things, all that kind of jazz. And also my time and actually researching, writing, editing, all that kind of stuff as well. Obviously all of that gets covered by Patreon support, or indeed you can actually become a member on Ko-fi if you prefer. And obviously you just get the exclusive episode for that one. But again, you can get those every month by supporting on Ko-fi, which if you don't like Patreon might somehow be easier, and then you'll get the updates in your emails. But anyway, other than that, I hope that you're well. I hope that November's treating you nicely, and I'll see you next week when we have a look at some New York islands. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.